I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Parallax is you observe an object, you see a change, but that change is not really a change in the object, but just a change in how you relate to the object in your perspective of the object.
Welcome to the testing room of the Parallax Corporation's Division of Human Engineering. You will now please crouch to the chair. And you will sit down. Make yourself comfortable. And be sure to place each one of your hands on the box on either side of the chair. Making sure that each one of your fingers is on one of the white rectangles. Just sit back, nothing is required of you except to observe the materials that are presented to you. Be sure to keep your fingers on the box at all times. Alright? Hope you find the test a pleasant experience.
On this edition of Parallax Views, the controversial Nikolas Schreck returns to the program to discuss his latest musical work, The Illusionist, and the upcoming updated edition of the Manson File, which will serve as the final chapter of his 30-year personal investigation into the saga of Charles Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders. Now, if you're not familiar with Nikolas Schreck, he was a key figure in the 80s and 90s underground culture that we discussed with Shane Bugbee on a recent edition of the program. This culture dabbled in what could more or less be described as deliberate provocation through subjects and imagery such as Satanism, fascism, and the Manson family. During his time in this milieu, Schreck gained notoriety vis-a-vis his band Radio Werewolf, which dealt with all of those aforementioned topics. In addition to musical endeavors like Radio Werewolf, Schreck has also been involved in film and writing. For example, Schreck directed the documentary Charles Manson Superstar in 1988. And in 1989, Radio Werewolf appeared in the cult comedy Mortuary Academy. His books include The Satanic Screen, an illustrated guide to the devil in cinema, Flowers from Hell, a satanic reader, Demons of the Flesh, the complete guide to left-hand path sex magic, co-authored, I should add, with his then-wife, Xena, the daughter of Church of Satan founder Anton LaVey, and, of course, the previously mentioned The Manson File. Today, Schreck is a practitioner and teacher of Tantric Buddhism residing in Berlin, Germany. He has, to varying degrees, left behind that underground culture from which he first gained notoriety. Although, as he told us in his last appearance, he still considers the devil an old friend. In this conversation, we begin by discussing his latest musical work, The Illusionist, his love of musicians like Nico and the psychedelic rock icon Rocky Erickson, and working with the late post-punk drummer John Murphy. From there, we delve into his work on the Manson family and the Tate LaBianca murders. Schreck's view on said murders is that, contrary to Vincent Bugliosi's helter-skelter narrative, the killings were actually the result of a drug burn gone horribly wrong. Schreck lays out, in detail, the case for that in this conversation, while also commenting on Manson's involvement, his take on Roman Polanski, and the recent shocking statements made by a protege of Jay Sebring, a victim of the Tate murders, bolstering Schreck's argument that the murders involved drugs. This leads us into a discussion of 20th century America's hidden history, specifically organized crime's role in the Hollywood film and record industry, with a particular focus on the mob-connected lawyer Sidney Korshak. Additionally, Nikolas gives his views on the popularity of conspiracy theories in relation to the murders, and in light of the new book, Chaos, by Tom O'Neill. This leads us into a discussion of conspiracy theories about government mind control and satanic cults, both of which receive harsh criticism from Schreck. We then begin to conclude the conversation by delving into two figures with whom Schreck had experiences with. First, Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. Schreck has extremely harsh words to share in regards to LaVey, and perhaps even a few bombshells. In relation to LaVey, Schreck and I also discuss Ragnar Redbeard's Might Makes Right, a book popular among Satanists, which has since come under renewed scrutiny after being referenced by the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooter earlier this year. Then we pivot our attention to the neo-Nazi leader James Mason, who gained notoriety in the 1980s with his newsletter Siege, which advocated for lone wolf terrorism against the quote-unquote system. Like Ragnar Redbeard and Might Makes Right, Mason and Siege have since experienced a resurgence of interest thanks to its discovery by a certain segment of what is known as the alt-right. More broadly, this portion of the conversation allows Schreck to share his insights on current issues such as incels, the rise of quote-unquote alternative facts, and the Trump presidency. Now, I must note, I myself am a leftist. Nikolas, as he is quick to point out, is not a fan of either the far right or far left in what has been referred to in America as the culture war. That said, I wanted to let Nikolas have his say, especially in light of the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting and the Mason Siege revival in the alt-right, because I believe he has insights into the psychological aspects and absurdities of the alt-right and Trumpism. With that in mind, why don't we jump right into the conversation? Welcome back to Parallax Views, Nikolas Schreck.
We meet again. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Nikolas, maybe for my listeners that didn't get a chance to hear the last episode we did together, it was a massive three-parter. Maybe you could just introduce yourself to my new listeners.
No, they have to go back and listen to all 3 hours of it, and then they can even dare to listen to this one. Well, where do I begin to introduce myself? Really, I'm the worst person to do that. I have to allow you to do that because I'm too close to myself to introduce myself.
Fair enough. People can go back and listen to the intro we do before each actual conversation in the podcast, so people can listen to that.
I don't know who I am. I'm the last person to ask, so they can decide that.
That reminds me of a Timothy Leary quote. When he was asked who he was, he said, "You get the Timothy Leary that you deserve."
Yeah, for the most part, he was a fool and a charlatan, but occasionally had a good one-liner. He was he was a competent stand-up comedian, so I will agree with that.
Well, there's been a lot of news since we had you last on, a lot of developments in the world of Charles Manson, something you have been investigating for a long time now, and also you have a bit of new music out, and I wanted to lead with that. Maybe you could tell my listeners a little bit about your new album, The Illusionist, which is available now from Ad Nauseam Records, I believe?
That's correct. And The Illusionist is the first of a series of my work as a solo artist, which re-began in 2014 when I did a ritual performance in Dresden with the late John Murphy. We did a sonic ritual that was cover versions of many of the female singers who actually inspired me to become a singer and a musician, and that was deliberately the ceremonial opening of this phase of my, what you could call my solo career as a singer and musician. And since then, it's mutated into a full band. So we released this album in August, and actually the album was released on Ad Nauseam at an event in Los Angeles on August 10th on the 50th anniversary of the La Bianca murders, after a showing of the 30th anniversary screening of my film Charles Manson Superstar. I gave a lecture about the state of Mansonology 50 years later in my own research in the Manson File, updating the audience as to what my most recent findings are in this never-ending abyss of a case. And after that, I did a ceremonial record signing for the release of The Illusionist. And there is a Manson connection there, as there always seems to be, in that one of the impresarios that runs Ad Nauseam Records, Manuel V, was a friend of Charles, like I was, but we didn't really know each other. They were both from the Hollywood music underground, and Charlie kept pushing Manuel to put out some of my music. And he as the former drummer of Radio Werewolf said, Charlie was like our PR agent in prison, and he was always very supportive of my music. And so he kept encouraging Manuel V of Ad Nauseam Records to put out one of my records. So finally we made that happen. But actually Charlie was the spark there. And one of the songs on The Illusionist, This Hideous Thing, which we're currently in production of a music video for, is my final musical interpretation of the Cielo Drive event in a rather abstract way. And so there is even a Manson connection there. But it officially was released on August 10th. And, as I don't know who said it, it's been attributed to Frank Zappa, but, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. It's hard to describe it, but I'm quite satisfied that it communicates where I am musically at this moment exactly the way I wanted to, and in many ways that's thanks to my very skilled and accomplished band, which is Winfried Strauss on keyboards, Onesorg on bass, and Heathen Ray on battery and percussion and drums. And so the creation of The Illusionist took about 2 years to come together, but it finally did come together in a perfect way, and that was a perfect day to release it in Los Angeles in August. And as you said, it's available from Ad Nauseam Records. And very soon a new video for one of the songs on it, the Futura model, will be released online, and then the next one will be a video for This Hideous Thing, another epic psychedelic song on that album.
I just wanted to ask, with regards to The Illusionist, maybe we could talk a little bit about your influences for it, and also what I really like about your music is that, most people in the quote-unquote underground music scene, there's this veneer of being, serious at all times. Sort of this dour humorlessness. And, I think going back to the days of Radio Werewolf, which you were, very famous for within these circles, right on up to the Illusionist, there's sort of a sense of playfulness and humor to your musical work, which I think is a breath of fresh air in comparison to a lot of other quote-unquote underground musicians.
Well, I take the themes that I'm addressing musically seriously, but sort of the way that I approach life with a great deal of black humor. And in Sanskrit, there's the word lila, the playfulness of the gods. And since the theme of the Illusionist is an illusion, when you start to see what an illusion we are in, how can you possibly take it completely seriously? So a certain sense of subversive humor is very necessary as a leavening. I mean, there's a kind of grim seriousness that I know what you're talking about in alternative music, a pretentiousness and a pompousness, which I try to puncture, and I don't particularly take myself very seriously either. And even at the height of the controversy of Radio Werewolf, we played with our own image and sort of self-satirized it. So there's a kind of trickster element to my music for sure. So it's not, on one hand, it's not comedy, but there is, as there is in all aspects of life, comedy and tragedy are very closely intertwined. So humor is very important to my approach to the arts and to my own existence.
What were the influences for the Illusionist musically? I mean, you've worked in so many different genres, death rock. I don't know if I would say industrial noise and dark ambient on some of the Radio Werewolf albums, and even gospel music. Where would you place the Illusionist within that, other than a psychedelic sort of jam?
Yeah, I can't really again, sort of like the question of introducing myself. Music for me, and I've spoken about this in some of my recent lectures on sonic magic, which you can find online because I've been speaking a little more openly about my methods and strategies of creating music. For me, the crux of music is the song. And the reason that I'm wildly eclectic in what I've done, and I understand that people need genres and labels. I myself never use the phrases death rock, gothic, ambient, etc. To me, what is the right sound for this particular song is what I try to summon, and there isn't a lot of conscious effort to it. There's a very thin line between the visionary quality of creating a song and madness, because a melody comes to you out of nowhere. You don't know where it comes from, and this is why music is the most spiritual of the art forms, because it's a completely invisible, intangible, a sound that comes to you, and I feel then compelled to follow. It's almost as if these songs on the Illusionist, but on much of my prior work as well, if not all, I almost feel like they already exist, and I am the medium which brings it into being, into this world. So I would change the style and the genre based on what that particular song seems to require. So, I mean, on the Illusionist, I think it's probably the broadest range of anything I've done yet, but I can let the listener decide that, because each song is its own isolated world, and it requires its own sound. And I've never wanted to be confined to one particular genre. Though I would say, anyone who hears the Illusionist will certainly hear definite strains of psychedelia, of, for instance, even one of the people at Ad Nauseam, Luca Fischer, called it esoteric lounge on one level, because there's a certain jazz element, and to the degree that I was influenced by some of the classic crooners from the 30s to the early 60s.
Are you a fan of Russ Columbo?
Yes, absolutely. I love
He's the
all
one
those
everyone
old...
forgets.
Yeah, no, he was a great crooner. So I would say I see myself to a certain extent within the tradition of those crooners, although also avant-garde music. So I can't really say. It's the main thing is I open myself and these songs come to me and I try to communicate them, and I never quite get them exactly. It's close to what, I am a vehicle for these things, and they come to me and I try to communicate them, but I try not to define them or make too much sense of them in any rational way. But on a more mundane level, I can say that the things that musically influenced me, I think when I was younger, I've said this before, I was quite snobbish and elitist about rock music. And for the most part, though I liked some of it in the 60s and 70s, I looked down upon it as sort of some sort of proletariat entertainment for the masses. And I was much more interested in actually avant-garde classical music of the mid-20th century, like Ligeti, Penderecki, Messiaen. Those were the musicians that really inspired me. And a turning point was in 1977 when I attended a concert of Iggy Pop's comeback tour, the Idiot Tour of 1977, and Bowie was playing keyboards for him, and Blondie, which was then an almost completely unknown act, opened for them. And actually, it may surprise people, but the performance of Debbie Harry and then Iggy Pop and Bowie on keyboards, before that, I would probably have moved into some sort of theater or opera or musical theater direction, something like that. That was the direction I was moving with my music. And seeing that performance of the Idiot Tour in 77 is what made me decide that using the structure of rock music, or at least the format of rock music, was the more effective theater. And also at the time I was very affected by Antonin Artaud's theater of cruelty concept. So it seemed to me that that was a more direct way of reaching an audience. So I would, so I feel a little bit alien to rock music, and yet I use its structure and its format for particular goals and reasons. And that was true even beginning with Radio Werewolf. Though I don't even know what you would call the music that I'm producing now. I really wouldn't be able to put it in any particular genre.
There were just two more questions I wanted to ask you in regards to music. You mentioned John Murphy. He passed away in 2015, and I think he's very unheralded in a lot of ways. You have to be sort of in the know to know who he is, but he's worked with everyone. He worked with everyone, I should say, from Current 93, Gene Loves Jezebel,
Nico, particularly.
I was going to say Nico next. Nico's the big one because I know
I
you're a huge Nico fan.
I have to say, too, I'm more than a Nico fan. I'm like a Nico devotee, and she had such a gigantic influence on me as a teenager because she just seemed to create as I attempt to. I mean, I don't know if I succeed, but I attempt to be open to inspiration the way she was and just let music from some other world come through me. And that's why I liked her music so much, because she wasn't trying to fit into any genre. It was pure. So she was a great inspiration on me, and I had a chance to meet her twice and see her perform a few times. So definitely she has been like a muse and inspiration, and I think greatly underrated. So the fact that John worked with Nico on the Drama of Exile album was, one of the many things that made him great to work with. But above and beyond, he was just a phenomenal musician, and we understood each other completely. We had a very deep rapport, and like me, he was not limited to any one genre. He came from a jazz background, and so he could play anything, and so we were really on the same wavelength in that way. And when he died, we had a very ambitious plan to continue what we were doing. So it took a while for me to refine a new direction. But yeah, we had a great bond and friendship and musical collaboration, and we shared a lot of the same tastes in obscure music. I mean, we both were very shaped by krautrock when we were younger, for instance. Yeah, so his loss was very great, not only to me, but to the entire alternative music community. And as you say, he's beloved by those who remember him and know who he was, but he himself chose to be in the background. He was very much without ego. And so though everyone he was a musician's musician. If you know what a great drummer he was, and how sensitive and how in tune with whatever musician he was playing, he brought something to the artist. He didn't push his personality, and so he wasn't like a showbiz guy. He colored your music with what you wanted, and that made him a very great and sensitive drummer.
Well, and the other question I had, and I'm going to make a comment before I pose this question. Since you mentioned Nico, I want to say this because people always get upset when I say it, and I like stirring the pot sometimes. I always loved...
I would never do that. I would never want to stir the pot.
I always loved that she did a cover of The Doors and Jim Morrison's The End, and I always tell people that's actually better than the Jim Morrison version, which I don't care for that much.
No, I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do think Nico is... I mean, I remember when in the 70s being a Nico fan it's kind of like if you say you appreciate Yoko Ono's music, which I actually also do actually appreciate some of Yoko Ono's music. It's like it used to be considered in the 70s like Nico was not even a musician, not even worth taking seriously at all, that she was just an adornment for Lou Reed or Andy Warhol or John Cale or Federico Fellini, that she was basically a model. And, who is she to impose her bizarre creations? But I think, unfortunately, after her death, her legacy is starting to be recognized. What an original and unique musician she was.
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways, and this leads into my final question with regards to music, I think Nico almost fits into that outsider music category. And I don't know if you would consider what you do outsider music, but I know you have some interest in outsider music. I saw that on Facebook you gave some words about the passing of Daniel Johnston, and also I found out recently that you had visited the great Rocky Erickson, who is, to me, a psychedelic rock legend that sort of dealt with a lot of horror motifs that both you and I are fans of.
Yeah, well, Rocky Erickson, like Nico, I mean, his place in my pantheon of influences is, I can't even emphasize how much I love the 13th Floor Elevators and the Blythe Alien period when he was doing after he got released from the insane asylum. And so Zena and I visited him in Austin at his home and got to know him and his mother fairly well. And it was, as you can imagine, it was great to meet him, but also nightmarish because he was at the height of his schizophrenic madness. And when we went into his home, he had all of the radios, TVs, and even the machines you have to pick up police signals. All of them were going full blast so he could chase away the voices tormenting him in his head. So we had a interesting conversation with him to the degree that he could focus. And it was inspiring but also terrifying, because like outsider musician I can relate to a bit, but there's something almost quaint about it and also condescending, implying that the music establishment, wherever that is the arbiter of taste, and that's the real music, and then the outsiders are not really doing real music. But I think the Nikos, the Rocky Ericksons, the Charles Mansons, the Daniel Johnstons, and many, many others, Charles Ives. You know, the people who are really artists are not playing the pop music game. They're not doing that, you know, very corny hustle. They're creating something pure and original. And those are the people, not the only people, but many of the musicians I admire are I guess in that outsider category. But again, who defines the inside and the outside?
Well, I want to interject real quickly on that. One of my favorite musicians that gets called sort of an outsider is this fellow by the name of Wesley Willis, who did like synthesizer music, and he was this schizophrenic homeless man basically, but he got support by people like Jello Biafra and whatnot, and a lot of his music was about his personal demons. And I think people like him now in this ironic way, but I actually like it sincerely because, you know, musicians like Wesley Willis, Rocky Erickson, they were dealing with real things, their real demons, their lives, their thoughts, which you don't get that from the pop musicians.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very good point. I mean, let's take most of Gothic music and death rock, which I'm associated with more and more, actually, as that recedes into becoming like this antiquated genre. For instance, there's a new book, which I mentioned a few times, that's coming out finally very soon, this magnum opus by Mikey Bean about the history of death rock. And he interviewed me extensively as far as the Radio Werewolf portion of my career and its relation to death rock. And I was even an outsider, even in the genre that I'm most associated with, because that's exactly what I think was missing from most Gothic and death rock music, is it's a lot of it is merely decorative. It is evoking these themes without really facing the darkness and the true demonic energy that somebody like Rocky Erickson really was dealing with. And so to me, that's the big difference, is the authentic confrontation with one's inner life, whether it's joyful or horrific, agony or ecstasy. That's what I'm looking for in music or art or film or any creative endeavor. But the phony, the pretense of it, the safe sort of playing house with the demonic doesn't particularly interest me. So I think, you know, that's the difference between the real thing and a safe suggestion of the real thing.
You know, I think this is a good segue into, you know, I guess you're close to closing the chapter on your investigation into Charles Manson and the Manson family and the Tate LaBianca murders. And I think the connection there is your work has always grappled with the real versus the illusion. And there are a lot of illusions associated not only with the Manson family, but also Hollywood in general. And I think a lot of that is starting to sort of peel away. I was just reading an article in the Hollywood Reporter about how Jeffrey Epstein was able to move freely throughout Hollywood, even after 2008 when it became known his activities, we'll say. And I think Hollywood is experiencing a moment where the mask is coming off, and I think that relates to your work in the Manson case.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only my work in the Manson case, but, you know, after all the decades of everything I've done, I would say the red thread between all of my work is exploring what is the reality and what is the mask. And as I underscored in the title of my new album, The Illusionist, which I myself don't know who is the illusionist that I'm referring to, but that's the central key. And when we get into my forthcoming novel, The Dallas Book of the Dead, that too is about what is the real reality behind the masks and the Maya and the illusion. I mean, that is definitely my main theme in every creative endeavor I've done. What is the truth behind the legend, behind the myth? What is actually going on behind the smoke and mirrors? And so in this new album, The Illusionist, or in the Manson File, or even in my other books. In the book I co-wrote with Zena, Demons of the Flesh, there's this popular concept of something called the left-hand path, and there we took it as our task to say that's not what it really is. This is what it really is. It's actually not at all what you think it is. So that, I think, is at this point in my life, I can see that whether I chose it or not, is my theme. With the Manson case, it's hard to convey this to people, that the interest in it that I have is not particularly in the mechanics of what happened with this particular crime, because it's actually Charlie's philosophy, his music, his spiritual understanding, his ecological activism. All of that is really what drew me to him, and I only sort of accidentally, through knowing him and then through a series of bizarre synchronicities, really stumbled on, through accident, as we discussed in the 3-hour epic interview you mentioned earlier that we did on your show. I stumbled into understanding what these crimes are really all about. And as you say, the average person would say, what is the Manson case? They would think it's about hippies and cults, and maybe has some kind of occult significance. And it's something about bizarre misfits on the, outcasts, outsiders, again, on the fringes of society. But on the contrary, as you suggested, what the Manson case really is, when you look deeply into it, has much more to do with something like Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein. It's illusion within illusion, because you have Hollywood, the dream factory, which creates the subconscious of the world, the dreams of the whole planet for over a century now. And what's really going on in Hollywood? What's really happening backstage? How do these movies get produced? How do people get cast? How do these illusions, these waking dreams of the cinema, who's creating them, and what criminals are behind them, and what are the real motives of sexual exploitation, which, if you've ever lived in Los Angeles, you see what a corrupt and venal system Hollywood really is. So that's what the Manson case is really about, is Hollywood manicuring and controlling its image and protecting its reputation. And what the late Robert Evans, who just died a few weeks ago, like Epstein, like Weinstein, he, along with Sidney Korshak, a very powerful mafia lawyer who was involved in pulling the strings of politics and of entertainment together, which now, look at America, politics and entertainment are really indistinguishable. They are one phenomenon, where you have a reality TV show having succeeded an old cowboy actor. We've had decades now of entertainment and crime and Hollywood, all, and politics, all being one conglomerate. And maybe that even goes back to Joseph Kennedy, the former head of a film studio, sort of stage managing his son's career like a movie star to the presidency. So it may surprise people who don't think of the Manson case being that, but as you really get into the nitty-gritty of what it is, that's what it's about. It's Hollywood's, it's the ugliest skeleton in Hollywood's closet.
Well, I want to get into maybe a summation of your work on the Manson case, and I think the way to start with this is, obviously we have the Vincent Bugliosi helter-skelter narrative. Manson was trying to start a race war, but I find it very interesting that on July 30th, 2019, The Hollywood Reporter, and that is the news outlet of establishment Hollywood.
I know where you must be leading, and yes, The Hollywood Reporter is the Bible of the Hollywood establishment. You can't get more conservative. You can't get least willing to rock the boat. And of course, I know where you're going, because that was a landmark moment in the whole understanding of the Manson case. But I know where you're going, but now I'll let you go there.
Well, they released an article by Tatiana Siegel entitled Manson victim's friend posits alternative motive. Quote, I
Mm-hmm.
never bought into the race war theory. And the person in question is Jim Markham, a hairstylist turned mogul whose clients included Paul Newman and Steve McQueen. And he was a protege of the victim, Jay Sebring, in the Manson murders.
Right, right. He was actually the successor, and Sebring named him to take over Sebring International, and he taught him his trademarked haircutting techniques. And of course, he knew all of Sebring's secrets, as I discovered in talking to many people who were involved in the Polanski, Tate, Sebring, Frykowski social circle. Everybody knew that. I mean, everyone in Hollywood absolutely knew without the shadow of a doubt Jay Sebring was the Candyman, the main drug dealer for the Hollywood elite. And what you're getting at here in this article is the Hollywood Reporter, the very epitome of the Hollywood elite establishment, saying that this whole helter-skelter thing was a lie, and that all along the people who actually knew the victim knew that it was about drug dealing. So that is a huge explosion in the world of illusion. Again, it's finally revealing what I have known since the 90s, and of course what the Hollywood elite has been trying to hide. And I'm glad that you pointed it out, because it's interesting that it has not. I don't know of a single other article that followed up on it. Whereas every other little trivial thing about the Manson case, usually tabloid papers and television, grabs onto it and tries to suck some kind of clickbait out of it. I don't know that anyone has even referred to this, which is the most important revelation about the case in decades.
Well, I guess summing it up, Markham basically references a drug deal gone bad. Maybe for my listeners, you could sum up what's been called the drug burn angle on the Manson, the Tate LaBianca murders.
Right. Well, first of all, I have to preface that because it's very easy to look at this as a kind of entertaining alternative theory, conspiracies. It can become a hobby. And I'm saying quite unequivocally and categorically that is what happened. I know this from Manson and from people who told me who knew Polanski. Everyone in that limited but fairly wide world of people in the Hollywood music, drug, and orgy scene that was going on in Hollywood at the time during the swinging 60s knew that on the night of the Cielo Drive murders, August 8th to 9th, 1969, that a major amount of drugs was being delivered there to Jay Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski. Basically, this would be the party supply for Hollywood for weeks and months to come. A huge amount of drugs were delivered there, and many of the most illustrious or degraded, depending on your point of view, names in Hollywood were waiting for their drugs to be delivered by Sebring after this big drop-off was made. So people like Robert Evans, Steve McQueen, Mama Cass, many others knew, and George Lazenby, Jill St. John, many Hollywood figures, some forgotten, some remembered, knew that this, Friday night, the drugs are going to be delivered, and the drugs will be dropped off to the clients and customers. And when Sebring ended up after midnight not showing up and nobody could reach him, people already suspected the worst. So to sum up the research I've done into this case, I don't have the slightest doubt what happened on that night. And I still want to make it clear, I do not know exactly why or what happened on the LaBianca night. That is more mysterious, the night after. But to sum up the murder part of my research, it was a drug deal that what really happened was Linda Kasabian, who was a drug dealer prior to her even getting involved with the Manson commune, and Tex Watson, who had been burning people on drugs even before he met Charlie through Dennis Wilson, who plays a very important, much more important role in the whole saga than the Beach Boys would ever allow. They both were independently criminals, and they came together, Kasabian and Watson, and they were basically going to Cielo Drive to get revenge on Wojtek Frykowski, probably the name that is least mentioned by the media, but was in fact the impetus and the trigger, literally, for the crime, because he had burnt Kasabian and Watson. Frykowski was going into the MDMA business, the drug that eventually became ecstasy. He was trying to introduce it into the Los Angeles drug market through Canadian connection, and he burnt, to use the vernacular of the drug world of that time, Kasabian and Watson, and they were angry at him, and they went back because they, like everyone else in the Hollywood dope world, knew this big delivery was coming. So they went there to rob Sebring and Frykowski, and it turned ugly and turned into a panicky, speed-inspired murder because Tex was on methadone, and he was totally fucked up on belladonna and many other drug abuse adventures that he had recently had since April of that year, on top of being a sociopath, which doesn't help. It turned into a panicky murder, what was supposed to be a robbery. And then, as I explain in detail in the Manson File, more interesting than the murders themselves, which are really quite banal criminal retribution that we see going on in the drug world every day, what is really historically significant is that the powers that be in Hollywood and politics and organized crime conspired to cover up what really happened, along with the help of the media, which to this day, although their grip on it is fading after 50 years, continue to push the real conspiracy theory, which is helter-skelter, that these people didn't know each other, that it was a murder of random strangers, that it had to do with hypnotizing, innocent middle-class youth to go killing. This is folktale. That's literally just like an urban legend that has become accepted as reality. And again, to get into my main theme of what is illusion and what is real, the reality, which I'm saying was a squalid drug deal, is dismissed as an illusion, except there you had this recent revelation in the Hollywood Reporter, which changes the whole narrative, and the fiction that was created by Vincent Bugliosi and many other co-conspirators, including Paul Caruso, Sidney Korshak, Richard Caballero, other figures that students of organized crime will recognize, Robert Evans, Terry Melcher, and Roman Polanski, of course. These people conspired to present a cover story. And that is the crux of what this is about, is a 50-year cover story to cover up something much more sordid that would have, in 1969, totally destroyed the careers of everyone involved and shown what was really happening in Hollywood, which I think would surprise absolutely nobody now, after we've seen the extent that the Weinsteins and the Epsteins went to cover up their peccadillos and crimes. It's the same thing. It's powerful people protecting their reputations at any cost. And I will only add the final thing about it, the fear and the dread that I still encounter when I track people down who are still survivors of this, who still have information about what really happened. If your listeners could only hear how much fear they still have after 50 years, you would understand the stakes that were at play and just how risky a game this cover-up has been.
Well, maybe before we get into the cover-up, let's talk a little bit about why would Cielo Drive become this sort of hotspot for delivering drugs, and also maybe we can get a little bit into the figure of Roman Polanski, because I think he's a much even darker figure than what we found out already about him.
Well, he's a darker figure to this extent that I will say this, that as far as I can understand from all the evidence I gathered, he knew why his wife was murdered. He knew that she died because of his refusal to kick Wojtek Frykowski and his girlfriend Abigail Folger out of their house, despite Sharon Tate pleading with him, which she said to her best friends and to her mother, you know, these people have turned our house while she was away in Italy working on a film, and while Polanski was away in England, they had taken over their house as drug dealing central for Hollywood. And, you know, street hippies and, you know, people from the gutter were up there at this mansion buying drugs from Wojtek Frykowski, who was an abusive, violent drunk who had, a month before the murders, actually raped another male drug dealer at Cielo Drive as part of a revenge against him. So this was the cutthroat world that Sharon Tate returned to, and she begged Polanski, get these people out of our house. And he didn't, and he lives with that. And, you know, just today, this very day in The Guardian, we saw that Polanski was accused by yet another woman who said that he raped her in 1975 when she was 18 in his ski resort home in Stade, Switzerland. So an extremely dark figure who, as far as I can gather, has kept this lie going that his wife was the victim of this insane cult, rather than that she died as the direct consequence of his irresponsibility of not getting Wojtek Frykowski, a dangerous and, you know, a time bomb waiting to happen, out of his home. So that's pretty dark.
Well, in regards to Manson himself, how does he tie into all of this? Because I've seen a lot of people say that you're simply a Manson apologist, and I don't get the impression that, despite your friendship with Manson, you essentially have said that Manson was kind of a crook. He was from the criminal underworld. That he's not a completely innocent figure. So where do you see Manson's time into this?
I'm always referred to as Manson apologist, you know, and this is a strange thing is, I mean, he wasn't kind of a crook. He was, he was a very close friend. I cared about him. I'm sad that he died. I liked him. We had a friendship that went above and beyond my research into his life and this particular case. But I was able to see him quite clearly as what he was, which he never pretended to be anything else, but he was totally dedicated with a passion to the underworld. And he would be the last person to deny it. There's a lot of people in his circle of admirers who would like to whitewash him and pretend, you know, but what kind of crook was he? He was an auto thief. He was a pimp. He was a drug dealer. You know, he would do credit card scams. He was a very prosaic, low-level criminal on that level, and proud of it. That's what he did for a living. And he was also a musician. You know, he didn't know which way to go. And I don't believe he could have ever completely gone straight, but he was a talented musician as well. That was the main thing that attracted me to him, and why I could get along with him was as a fellow artist and musician. That was the rapport we had. But I'm not an apologist for him, and he read the final edition of the Manson File, and despite it quite clearly, you know, making it evident he was an accessory to this murder, he went back to the crime scene and helped cover up the evidence, and definitely was probably part of dragging the bodies around and setting up this grotesque scenario to protect his friends. You know, that's not a nice guy, and I've never pretended he was, and he never pretended he was. All I'm saying is he did not order those killings, and he was an accessory to the murders, and he was a beneficiary to a burglary, to a robbery, and he admitted that in a phone call that I played at this lecture that I gave August 10th, that has more to do with the La Bianca murders. I mean, he admitted it was a robbery. And actually, there's a whole other side of it that this gets into. He was being extorted by the Straight Satans, the motorcycle club, because of their knowledge of his involvement in the shooting of Bernard Crowe and his nearly fatal cutting of Gary Hinman, who Bobby Beausoleil killed a few weeks before the Cielo Drive event. He was being extorted by the Straight Satans, and part of the money and drugs that came from Cielo Drive and the money and whatever else may have come from the La Biancas was paid off to the Straight Satans. So really, this crime had a lot to do with him being extorted. But does that make me an apologist? I don't, I'm just saying it's not what you think it is. If you think Charlie was evil incarnate who hypnotized people to kill for him, and it's not good enough that I'm just telling you he was a fairly ordinary crook who was doing exactly what people in the underworld do, then I guess I'm an apologist. But I'm, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a realist. And there are people who are Manson admirers who consider me not worshipful enough. So you can't win. Either I don't make him evil enough or I don't make him enough of an innocent. But he's neither, and this was the nature of his message about Abraxas. He was more than a good guy or a bad guy. So it's a much more complicated figure, and I think I've come the closest in conveying who this person was, which is more interesting to me than what the crimes are about.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Linda Kasabian, and she factors into this greatly. She was, of course, Vincent Bugliosi's key witness. Her testimony, according to Bugliosi, led to the convictions. It's interesting because I believe there were defendants and, members of the Manson family that said it was Kasabian rather than Manson that had sort of masterminded the crimes. Since then, a lot of these former family members have said, oh, well, no, that's patently false. She couldn't have masterminded the crimes. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, we have to take a deep breath and distance ourselves from the whole language of this fairy tale that's been woven. Number one, masterminding these crimes. There was no mastermind involved. These were very sloppy, spontaneous, panicky crimes that came out of desperation. These people were not even competent criminals, and if it was not for the tragedy of the lives lost in the process, there's something almost tragicomic about how badly done these crimes were. So if Manson had devised the crimes, he was a professional criminal. As he said many times, if he had planned this, you would never know about it because he was a real criminal. These kids who went out stoned and angry, and Linda Kasabian, as you said, was at the crux of this. So that's the first thing. This was not some great masterminded crime. It was a disaster, a catastrophe that came out of some drugged, youthful people in conflict with some other slightly older, drugged, youthful people, the victims. That's the first thing, is to de-romanticize the idea that it was a plot, a plan, Beatles lyrics sending people out to kill. It was a panicky tragedy that occurred, and it destroyed many people's lives. But as far as Linda Kasabian, one point that I make is that people are always fretting and boo-hoo-hooing about the possibility of Leslie Van Houten or Bobby Beausoleil being released in their geriatric harmlessness of today, but they're not concerned that Linda Kasabian, who, as far as my research has indicated, was the co-instigator of this crime, along with Charles Tex Watson. These should be known as the Watson-Kasabian murders, not the Manson murders. Now, as far as what you said about Bugliosi presenting her as his key witness, it's true that without Kasabian's testimony, Manson would have walked. There was no evidence. Now, how did this come about? Gary Fleischman, who was Linda Kasabian's attorney, has described this, going back years, not only recently, but going back to the 90s, and even hinted at it as early as the 70s. Basically, Aaron Stovitz, one of the prosecutors in the case, and Bugliosi, made a deal with him that if Linda Kasabian would simply repeat the story that Bugliosi had come up with, the helter-skelter, Manson ordered the murders, cult, hypnosis, that basic scenario, that she would be given full immunity. And of course, as her attorney, he advised her, you should do this, you should take this deal. And Fleischman, who your listeners, if they're really interested, should look up, you will see he very cynically has admitted that the story that Kasabian told him about what the murders were had nothing to do with the story that she told in court that Bugliosi had concocted like a script for her to read. And if you look at the trial transcripts, Manson's pretty incompetent lawyer, Irving Kanarak, is continually making an attempt to try to make it clear to the jury that she is reading a scripted fiction, that this is not true, that she's been coached. So Fleischman has admitted that he cynically encouraged his client to repeat a fictional story of what these murders were about, that the prosecution invented, that the DA invented as a cover-up, and Kasabian did that, and she's been a free woman, and by the way, continued to be a drug dealer, and even her children were still involved in methadone trafficking, so nothing has changed.
Is that on record? That's not rumor, right?
No, it's not a rumor. I don't engage in rumors. It's been in the newspapers. It's been reported. She's not only continued to have drug problems, which she had even before she moved to Los Angeles. Before she moved to LA, she was arrested as part of a Boston acid network. So yeah, her involvement with drugs continued to this day, and even her daughter was a drug dealer, and that can be found in public record. So, what could really be more of a miscarriage of justice is a minor player like Leslie Van Houten, who I have no particular sympathy for, by the way, but, by any normal standard of jurisprudence, she would have been let out years ago, despite the crime she committed. If it wasn't as notorious and connected to the whole Manson myth, a youthful one-time offender would have not spent the entirety of her life in prison. And yet Linda Kasabian, who everybody who I talked to, including Manson, confirmed, and Manson made this very clear after the second edition of my book came out in 2011, and we had many conversations when he was able to call me on a cell phone and speak quite forthrightly without anyone listening. He made it clear that one of the biggest mistakes in his life was letting Linda Kasabian come on the ranch, as he admitted in his own self-deprecating way, because he wanted to have sex with her. And she, as much as Tex, is what led them all into this catastrophe. So, I can't overemphasize that enough, that Linda Kasabian's own attorney has admitted the story she told in court was perjury, that it was a story that Bugliosi invented for her to tell, and she accepted it in exchange for immunity. So, and there's it would take hours to explain all of the miscarriages of justice in that trial, but that is probably the key one.
Well, I don't want to get too deeply into the aspect of, how do I put this? People are going to say, well, why would Manson not just admit all of this? And the reason you've given, and I think it's plausible enough, is that Manson believed in a criminal code. In other words, since he was around criminals, he was sort of taught, you take that vow of silence. You don't rat on people. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one big level of it. He absolutely followed the old world criminal code of omerta, as it's said in Sicilian, of silence. You do not talk about what other criminals did. But it's very ambiguous, because in fact he did privately, to me and to many of his other friends and correspondents, he did speak quite openly. I mean, he approved what I wrote in the Manson File, and then when the second edition came out, he said, that's not quite right. Let me correct this. Let me tell you this. So he stuck to the criminal code in court. In most of his public interviews, he gave veiled references to things here and there, pointing to Tex Watson's actual motivations. If you have half a brain and listen to his cat and mouse interviews that he does with the mass media, he does what's called in the underworld dry snitch. He does reveal a lot between the lines and in poetic metaphor, but he did tell me quite bluntly, and he confirmed that this was about a drug deal, and I'm not sure that it's 100% true that it's only that he stuck to this semi-honorable criminal code of Omerta. It's also, he had his own reasons, and the fact is he had 50 years to tell us exactly what happened. He had nothing to lose by doing so, although he stated to me several times that early on he would have been killed in prison had he spoken exactly about what happened, because other people were the beneficiary of these crimes. Organized crime figures, as far as he explained it to me, would have definitely killed him. And he was able to speak about it a little more openly towards the very end of his life, because those, what he called the old men, were no longer there. So I don't have a full explanation of, if it was me, I would say, what do I many times, for instance, he'd have a parole hearing coming up, or at the time when he was still allowed to do interviews, I would say, why don't you tell some of the truth? Why don't you use this parole hearing as an opportunity to, at the very least, blow the minds of the public and finally debunk Helter Skelter with the facts? So there's a mystery there to me. In a way, I think he liked Helter Skelter because it was so absurd and ridiculous. He could criticize it and make fun of Bugliosi, as did the other Manson loyalists, but they never really came out and said, this is what it's about. And so I as much as Bugliosi covered up the crimes, I have to say, for most of his life and most of his public statements, Manson himself helped to cover up the crimes. And in a way, they worked with each other. In a way, everyone involved with this, the families of the victims, the criminals involved on the higher level of drug networks, the rock music and movie celebrities, the Manson commune loyalists, and the prosecution, all of them had one shared vested interest, which was to cover up what really happened. So, yeah. So despite I believe he meant what he said about sticking to the criminal code and not snitching, and he very often said to me, I'll tell you this much and no more. And I'd say, oh, can you give me a name? And he said, nope, I won't tell you who that was. Like, for instance, he admitted he went back to Cielo Drive after the murders to clean up the evidence, but he would never tell me who he went back with, and he never even told me the gender of that person. So he would reveal a lot, but never fully all, and he had the opportunity to.
Well, I want to get into some of the lesser-known players in this sordid tragedy. Before we do that, real briefly, what was Bugliosi's interest in, as you say, covering up the true story of the Tate murders?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first of all is you have to keep in mind that the original prosecutor was Aaron Stovitz, and you got to look deeper into who was really pulling the strings in the LA courts was Evil Younger, who, if you look into him, he's actually a very sinister figure who was connected to Richard Nixon, a close personal friend of J. Edgar Hoover, involved in COINTELPRO. And Evil Younger was the orchestrator of the Sirhan trial, which also was a cover-up and a scapegoating and a framing of, like Charlie, Sirhan was obviously up to no good. What was he doing there? He was clearly involved in a plot in some way, even if he was lured into it. But you got to look deeper into the whole James Ellroy-like darkness of Los Angeles to see Evil Younger, whose name never comes up, involved with this case, already had arranged a kangaroo court to convict Sirhan. That was like a trial run for the Manson trial. Now, Evil Younger fired Aaron Stovitz on very flimsy grounds and replaced him with Bugliosi. I believe Bugliosi was given the mission because he was a very ambitious, arrogant striver, who wanted to become a historical figure. He was given this opportunity by Evil Younger to take over the trial. And I believe it's clear that his mission was not so much to prosecute Manson and convict Manson, but to cover up what the crimes were about in order to protect the reputation of these particular people. Terry Melcher, who was connected to Doris Day, who was still a very powerful figure in Hollywood and happened to be an ex-lover of Ronald Reagan, who was then the governor of California. The Beach Boys, whose career would have been destroyed if it was revealed in court just how deeply Dennis Wilson was involved with Charlie in every way. I mean, he was practically a member of the commune, very different from the way that nostalgic rock fans would like to remember the story as Charlie.
He's essentially portrayed as just, Charlie was a pimp that got him women by the mainstream narrative.
Right, that's complete nonsense. I mean, he was, and this is revealed in great depth in the Manson File, is Dennis Wilson was at the center of the whole thing, and I believe actually committed obstruction of justice, because I believe that the very night of the murders, he knew that Tex Watson and to a degree Charlie had to be involved with these murders, as I think many music and rock people, including Terry Melcher, kept their mouths shut out of fear for getting dragged into this and fear of repercussions. For the 3 months before Charlie was arrested, I think they knew very well who had to be behind it and what happened. So it's a lot darker story than people think, and the rock figures that are so revered and looked at as innocent who, isn't it frightening that they encountered the sinister Charles Manson? That's not at all the way it really was. They were deeply corrupt and complicit. And Wilson admitted years later that he knew what the crimes were about. He told many people that. And one thing I'm so close to it that it's just everyday furniture of the case to me. But for instance, Terry Melcher, we now know, absolutely recorded with the Wrecking Crew, one of the most esteemed session musician units in LA rock history. He actually recorded music of Charlie's. That's how much he liked it and was ready to market it. So the whole myth that Charlie was a no talent who was rejected is the complete opposite of the truth.
Well, and I want to editorialize here a bit. If people are unaware of the organized crime elements that were in Hollywood and the record industry at the time, I mean, this is all stuff you can read about. It's not particularly well hidden if you look in the right places. I mean, during this time, you had Morris Levy, who was known as the octopus within, the record industry. He was, knee deep in the mob. I believe he was even convicted. So all of this stuff was going on in Hollywood at the time.
Well, yeah, but people just don't make the connection. Actually, now that we live in a post-literate age where people are lucky to grasp even the slightest fragment of false information from the internet and consider that they've done research, it's easy for you to say that, but most people don't know how to look deeply into it. But we can go even deeper. The Cray brothers in England were connected to Brian Epstein, and they were just one step away from the Beatles. Organized crime and music have gone hand in hand for, going back to Frank Sinatra and beyond. So that's a big, important part of the story. And as I get into in the Manson File, the involvement of the Beach Boys business manager, Nick Grillo, and his threats to send the mafia after Charlie, which I won't get into here because it's in the book, was a very important part of this. So yeah, or the way that organized crime and the music industry work together, even in more innocent terms like payola, rock music and organized crime were complicit at that time, and that's what this case is really all about.
Well, Nicholas, I want to get a little bit more into Sidney Korshak, but before we do that, there's a figure I want to touch on very briefly, and his name is Lawrence Schiller, and he's known as an American photojournalist, film producer, director, and screenwriter, still alive actually, but it's interesting because he gets involved in the Manson sort of story in his own way, and it's interesting because as soon as I looked over his bio, the first thing I said was, he's an ambulance chaser. He's been involved not only in Manson, but also in the O.J. Simpson case, the John Benet Ramsey case.
John Benet, Gary Gilmore.
Yeah, he's an ambulance chaser. I mean, it's sleazy as all get out.
He's sleazy and he's an ambulance chaser, but, and actually this is something I will ask your listeners to have some patience on. There's a magazine called Deep Truth Journal, which I wrote a fairly comprehensive article incorporating some of the material from the new Manson File, but also some material that isn't published in that concentrate, it's called The Co-Conspirators. And what it's about is the curious bridge between people who were involved with trying to debunk the Warren Commission. In other words, people who were working with the FBI and with other government forces to cover up the Kennedy assassination and to prove that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and that there was no conspiracy. And these people later get involved in the Manson cover-up. And that is a crucial hidden aspect of American history that I think needs to be understood. So there will be this article in Deep Truth Journal will be coming out soon, and that gets into detail on everything you're asking. Is Lawrence Schiller is more than an ambulance chaser, though he's obviously that too. Lawrence Schiller is interesting to this whole field of the secret history of American skullduggery because he went to Dallas immediately after the murders and managed to get to know and become Jack Ruby's, quote, business manager. He was responsible for getting a audio, quote, confession on Ruby's deathbed in which he cajoled Ruby to take back his claim to Gerald Ford and, in the Warren Commission report that there was a conspiracy. And so Lawrence Schiller was the last person to speak with, he smuggled in a tape recorder to Jack Ruby's hospital room when Ruby was dying under fairly mysterious circumstances, as you may know, and got him to admit or to confess that there was no conspiracy, despite the fact that Ruby said there was a conspiracy. He was right there in Dallas. He was one of the last people to meet Marilyn Monroe before she died. Which you can draw your conclusions there. He knew Frank Sinatra very well. He knew all the people. He knew Dennis Hopper, who was one of J. Sebring's main clients and who knew the whole truth of what the drug dealing aspect of the murders. Lawrence Schiller introduced Dennis Hopper to Charlie when Charlie was interested in selling the rights to his life story in 1970, shortly after his arrest and arraignment when he was in jail. Lawrence Schiller set up the meeting between J. Sebring's friend and client, Dennis Hopper, and Charlie Manson. So wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall to hear what went on in that conversation in which Hopper was negotiating to play Charlie because Charlie wanted Hopper to play him. So, and now the most important thing is that Lawrence Schiller had also been involved as an FBI informant in trying to smear the Garrison investigation into the Kennedy assassination in New Orleans. And he was involved with Jerry Cohen, a Los Angeles Times reporter who later, like Schiller, was deeply involved in reporting the Manson case. So you've got someone whose MO is, who is he working for, Schiller? He wrote one of the first books attacking the so-called conspiracy theorists who believe that Oswald did not act alone. He made a career of it. He produced and directed a film about Oswald, again, underscoring his guilt. So he's much more sinister than just an ambulance chaser, though he is clearly also that. Schiller bought out Norman Mailer, who was one of the main proponents of one of the most prominent literary figures to early come out and say that he did believe there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy and that Oswald had not acted alone, if he had acted at all. Schiller basically paid off Mailer to write this book about Oswald, in which Mailer, kind of like Ruby before him, refuted his previous belief in a conspiracy and said, yeah, it does look like Oswald acted alone after all. So I get into this in this article, which will be coming out, The Co-Conspirators, which is about the connection, also too much to get into here, Vincent Bugliosi. Why did he dedicate half of his life to writing this book about reclaiming history, which was, again, an attempt to debunk the debunkers of the Warren Commission? Why were Schiller and Bugliosi and other figures like Jerry Cohen, why were they involved in two of the biggest cover-ups in American history, the JFK assassination and the Tex Watson murders? And then the key point, too, with Schiller is that he was the front man for this effort to take Susan Atkins' confession and sell it to the media, which, as many people pointed out, including Rolling Stone and other magazines at the time, should have led to a mistrial, because basically Schiller took Susan Atkins' faked confession, which had been concocted by her mafia-connected lawyers, Caballero and Caruso, and sold it to the press, sold it to the public, so that this idea that Atkins put across of evil, hypnotic cult leader who hypnotized his hippie followers to kill for him and to kill random strangers, Schiller was instrumental in putting that cover story out into the media, thus guaranteeing there could be no fair trial and that the cover story would prevail over the truth that they were trying to conceal. So that's just a slight indication of how, what you know about Schiller, what you see of him, this sleazy hustler who's always around the corner of whatever sensational crime. There's something much more ominous going on with him.
Now, if I can editorialize a bit before I ask you this sort of next question or sort of subject that I want to cover, I want to talk a little bit about Sidney Korshak, and I want to give some background for listeners. Korshak is virtually unknown, despite probably being one of the hidden power brokers of American history in the 20th century. He was involved with the Chicago outfit and was basically a fixer and a lawyer for them. The FBI referred to him as the most powerful lawyer in the United States, and he was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and he ties into this Manson case. But before we get into that, I want to note that a few people have covered Sidney Korshak. Seymour Hersh did, which led Seymour Hersh into the story of Gulf and Western and Michael Sedona, which after that, Seymour Hersh never covered sort of private corporate corruption ever again because it was too much of a hassle. Nick Tosches, who just died, also covered it. Most famously, Gus Russo in the book Supermob. He got accused of anti-Semitism for that book. But I want to note that there was an interview with Sidney Korshak by a journalist, Peter Bart. And Peter Bart ended up becoming a film producer.
Well, Peter Bart, I should point out, for those who can put the pieces together, knew Roman Polanski, knew Robert Evans, was involved with Paramount Studios. And as Gene Gutowski told me, Peter Bart was right there when Roman Polanski returned from London to Paramount Studios, and in a private suite at Paramount Studios, which was Julie Andrews' private apartment for the film Darling Lily, I believe, they sequestered themselves. Robert Evans, Peter Bart, Sidney Korshak, and Polanski, and several others basically had like a war council. What are we going to do to cover up what these crimes are about? So, yes, Peter Bart would know because he was right there.
What I was going to say is, Sidney Korshak said to Peter Bart, this is the exact quote, folks, "Do you know what's the best insurance policy in the world that absolutely guarantees continued breathing?" Then he says, silence. After that, Bart burned his notes, and he went on to his Hollywood career. I think that says everything you need to know about Sidney Korshak.
It says everything about Sidney Korshak, and it says everything about this case and the other case that we will discuss, is that also not only was Sidney Korshak there to pull the strings in the Manson case for the benefit of his client and protege, Robert Evans, who was the head of Paramount, and to protect Polanski and to protect the whole collusion and synergy between organized crime and high-level music and movie production. In other words, the entertainment industry and the mafia. Korshak stepped in, and Korshak, I should point out, was sent from Chicago as an emissary of Murder Incorporated to replace Bugsy Siegel, who was killed probably by a friend of Charlie Manson's named Frankie Carbo, who was a boxing mafia kingpin, a syndicate leader in fixing boxing matches. So these things are very tied together. Sidney Korshak was sent in to replace the reckless and violent Bugsy Siegel when he was rubbed out, as a kind of gentle pressure on the Hollywood film industry rather than the more flamboyant and threatening Bugsy Siegel. So that tells you what his lineage is, you see?
Well, it's interesting. We can't get into all the details, but Korshak was involved with MCA, the Music Corporation of America, which, according to Dan Moldia, in the book Dark Victory, a true classic.
Well, yeah. Again, I know where you're going, is Sidney Korshak and Lou Wasserman through MCA is responsible for the career of the actor Ronald Reagan, moving into his more, successful acting career as the President of the United States and Governor of California. So yeah, Korshak is a name that every American should know, and that almost nobody does know. It's crucial to understanding the hidden history of who the power brokers in America are.
And the other case I was going to mention is he's involved with Gulf and Western, which, as I said, that's the point where Seymour Hersh said, "I'm done with this." And that connects to Michelle Sedona, who...
right, a powerful underworld figure.
Sicilian Mafia, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so that is the background to this whole thing, absolutely. And there are no, other than the handful of things you mentioned, there's very little about Sidney Korshak. In a way, considering his significance in the darker corridors of pulling the strings in American history, there's very little information about him. And the final thing I'll say about the Manson case involving him is Charlie knew all about Sidney Korshak's career, down to the last detail. He talked to me, Charles, about how Korshak could snap his fingers and destroy someone's career, admiringly, by the way. He knew how Sidney Korshak had been responsible for getting Al Pacino hired for The Godfather rather than the actor who was. So the interesting thing is, although Sidney Korshak covered up the true nature of the crimes, Charlie Manson knew an awful lot about Korshak's career and spoke of him in a kind of collegial, admiring way. I don't know that they ever met. I kind of doubt it, but he certainly, as Charlie was like an encyclopedia about the underworld and organized crime figures, if you knew about it, he knew every figure. He knew who was connected to what. And he spoke with a kind of admiration about Sidney Korshak, and he seemed to know a lot about his career, which again implies how close a relationship between organized crime in the entertainment business and Charlie and the Spahn Ranch. They were not two different worlds. They were part of the continuum.
So in final regards to the Manson case and these mob connections, what was Korshak trying to cover up? Was it just the mob, and was it protecting Polanski? What's the bottom line on Korshak's involvement?
I think it was multi-tiered. On one hand, he was direct. I mean, he was right there. He was called in as Mr. Fix-It the day Polanski came back from London with the news of his wife's murder. He was called in by Robert Evans as the man who had the clout to to call in the favors. Shut up about this. Don't report this. Don't talk about Sebring being a mafia drug dealer. And also protecting Paramount Studios, protecting the reputation of Polanski, of Sharon Tate, of all of these high-profile careers. The level we don't know is how much were the mafia involved in the execution of the crimes, how much were organized crime figures beneficiaries of money stolen and drugs stolen. That part I don't know, but I suspect, reading between the lines of things Charlie and others told me, it was not just about some, deranged hippies going out there and killing people. And this gets into obscure figures like Joel Rostow and Gino Massaro. There's a whole organized crime level to the Tate LaBianca killings, and that is certainly part of what Korshak was covering up. Another figure, just to mention in passing, just so you understand and your listeners understand how many powerful people had vested interests in covering up what happened to these victims, was Peter Folger, the father of Abigail Folger, was one of the wealthiest men in America at that time and had obviously a huge personal interest in covering up the fact that his heiress daughter, Abigail Folger, had been bankrolling Wojtek Frykowski and his drug dealing caper, and that had led to these horrific murders. So you have a combination. You have the Beach Boys going out of their way to cover everything up. You have Sidney Korshak, one of the most powerful people in America, who's a friend of the governor, Ronald Reagan. All of these people working together at a time when the media was limited to daily newspapers and 3 networks. It was very easy to say, this is the story we're going to push, and you're not going to push the real story. And this is what we're dealing with 50 years later. And a point that I always like to underscore, all of these people who hate Manson and have this knee-jerk feeling like, well, at least Bugliosi got those animals locked up. They believe in a cover story that criminals far worse than Manson concocted. So, the cover story about how evil the Manson family was is a fiction that Hollywood and the mafia and people like Sidney Korshak and Lawrence Schiller, very dubious people, put across to trick the public. So these good citizens who play along with it and exhibit this knee-jerk hatred of Manson as evil incarnate are actually suckers for a story that the mob invented to protect themselves and their powerful Hollywood interests.
Now we're going to segue into the topic of some figures that inserted themselves into the aftermath of the Tate LaBianca murders, namely James Mason, the neo-Nazi of Siege fame, and also maybe a little bit of discussion about LaVey and Satanism. But before I do that, I want to close out on Manson with something that I know you wanted me to ask you pointedly, and that is that now we're starting to see the cracks in the Bugliosi helter-skelter story. But maybe, just maybe, that's being replaced by another cover story, another sort of incorrect take on the Tate LaBianca murders in the form of these conspiracy theories about MK Ultra, most famously in Tom O'Neill's Chaos, We don't need to necessarily get into chaos specifically. I know you've done an interview about that with a friend of the show, Midnight Writers News, but maybe we could talk about the cover story that's now emerging, new cover story in a way.
Well, yeah, at first, the 50th anniversary of the crimes, to sum it up concisely, like you mentioned, the Hollywood Reporter article, which is extremely significant and should put a nail in the coffin. Here you have a friend of Jay Sebring saying exactly what I said, that the crimes were about drug dealing. Jay Sebring was a drug dealer. It had nothing to do with helter-skelter and race war. This is the very thing I've been saying for decades. There you've got not a crazed Manson apologist like me saying it, but a friend of Jay Sebring. So case closed as far as I'm concerned. I mean, many other people have told me that, but there you have the first person who was willing, who was part of the Polanski circle, to go public with that. That's a huge thing. There have been, the book Goodbye Helter Skelter by George Stimson, which debunks Helter Skelter, although we have this gentleman's agreement. He knows I don't agree with the motive he says is the sole motive, which was to free Bobby Beausoleil by making it look like copycat killers were out there. But George Stimson's book, which came out in 2014, Goodbye Helter Skelter, totally debunks Bugliosi. Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, which, as you said, I've analyzed in detail in a recent interview with Midnight Rider, so we don't need to be redundant. It debunks Bugliosi completely, and yet what you're seeing, even though there have been several mainstream or semi-mainstream television and books that now basically, for instance, there was a book, Creepy Crawling, that is by a very mainstream liberal academic. He dismisses Bugliosi as a liar and dismisses Helter Skelter, just as a matter of fact. Buddy Day wrote a book recently, the producer of this horrible, or a director of the horrific Manson funeral documentary that I don't even want to get into. He wrote a book called Hippie Cult Leader that also completely refutes Bugliosi. So as the smoke of the 50th anniversary clears, we can conclude that Vincent Bugliosi's reputation is done. In the modern parlance of millennials, he's canceled. He's finished. His reputation is totally in tatters, and only someone who's not keeping up with the degree of his mendacity that's been revealed could possibly believe that Helter Skelter is what it was touted to be, the true story of the crimes. But, as you say, there's no reason for optimism. Some people think, okay, that's great, Bugliosi has been finally debunked, and we see it's a lie. Immediately, what has replaced that lie is a lie even further from the truth, and this is becoming, and has become since Mae Brussel. It didn't begin just with Chaos. That just was the best known and most recent manifestation of this idea that, and then this gets into Dave McGowan and his very toxic and malign and mendacious effect on the way people think about the 60s and conspiracy thinking in general. I'm sure you're familiar with his work, at least tangentially.
I'm very familiar, and I will say this. I'm going to get in trouble for this episode because I have a lot of Mae Brussel fans that listen to this podcast. I think some of the stuff Mae Brussel says is interesting. It's food for thought, but...
Yeah, well, if you care about the truth. It's interesting doesn't mean true. She certainly has food for thought, as you said. But so this idea has been bubbling up for decades, really, since Mae Brussel, that, okay, it has to be looked at in two different ways. The Tate LaBianca murders were used by the conservative media and the Republican administration of that time to smear the hippie movement. That is a fact. Richard Nixon, even there's a recording on one of his secret tapes in the Oval Office where Richard Nixon is admitting that he made that statement about Manson being guilty quite wittingly and deliberately to win that case. So we know that Evel Younger, Hoover, Nixon, Reagan, the governor of California, deeply enmeshed in the mob and Hollywood and protecting his Hollywood friends, especially Doris Day and her son Terry Melcher, they used the image of Manson as the uber hippie to smear the hippie movement, and they successfully succeeded in doing that. The problem is that people put the cart before the horse and have been claiming for a while, and this started really with Mae Brussell a long time ago, that the CIA or the Army or some sinister faction in the U.S. government engineered the murders to smear the hippie movement. And, you know, usually and now as more and more people, information or a little bit of knowledge being a dangerous thing, as the saying goes, the more people have heard about what MK Ultra or Operation Artichoke was up to, the mind control program, which was pretty chaotic and pretty much a failure if you look at the real thing rather than the fantasy.
Well, and I want to note, the real thing is something that I think should be looked at, because there were legitimate human rights abuses. And I actually
Absolutely.
get very mad when, you know, so much of this MK Ultra stuff, and I know I'm going off into a tangent here, Nicholas, but much of it has been turned into pornography, especially for evangelical conspiracy theorists. This whole Project Monarch, sex slaves,
Nonsense.
Kathy O'Brien. Well, it's pornography for these people. It's porno.
Right.
And,
Right.
you know,
well,
this
these are
stuff is not
sexually repressed people that are titillated by the idea of sex slaves and all of that, and it even dragged in somebody that I knew very well, Michael Aquino, which I won't get into detail, but that's also nonsense. He's a wretched person, but he's not a pedophile, and he was not involved in MK Ultra. This just came up today in my Facebook page where somebody asked about that. So yeah, it's actually irresponsible, this, as you say, this pornography about MK Ultra. Look at the real facts of it. They are horrific enough. Every American, like Sidney Korshak, and every world citizen should know about the horrendous abuses that the U.S. government has perpetuated. But it shouldn't be allowed to be turned into this X-File fantasy. Let's look at the real thing, which was horrific enough. But now, I've researched this thing for 33 years. I have never found the slightest hint or evidence that the crimes had anything to do with the CIA. Now, because Colonel Paul Tate was part of Army intelligence and his daughter was killed, and Wojtek Wachowski was a expatriate of a Cold War enemy of America, some country in the Soviet bloc, Poland, there were initial suspicions from Central Intelligence and the FBI. Was this murder somehow involved with espionage or intelligence? But that was quickly disproven. That is the only connection, the legitimate connection. I've never seen any evidence of any CIA involvement. And as I've said in other interviews, the wrong idea about this CIA steering of the so-called Manson murders to destroy the hippie movement. I mean, wouldn't you say that's the gist of what most of these theories circle on?
There's a sense that there has to be a reason the hippies filled and ended up becoming yuppies. I think that drives a lot of it. And like I said, I have some affinity for the Brussels sprouts in some ways. I think Mae Brussell was able to collate a lot of interesting information with regards to Watergate, but I think there are no sacred cows for me.
Right. No, I mean, sure, I respect anyone who tries to find out the truth, but I'm the first to say if I got something wrong, and I have many times, and I correct it in the new Manson File. I say, okay, I thought this was true, now I see it's not. But if you're committed to truth, then there's no shame in that. But if you've got an axe to grind for some political ideology, so there's also a lot of hatred of the 60s. A lot of this is coming from a conservative hatred of the 60s to, like with McGowan, to prove rock music wasn't really rock music. It was all engineered by the CIA as a brainwashing apparative.
Can I
You know what I
comment?
mean?
Well,
Yeah, of
I
course.
wanted
No,
to comment.
it's your show. You're allowed to comment. You don't. It's everyone should ask me if they're allowed to comment. The world would be better if they did. But yes, by all means, you can comment.
Well, I think Dave was pretty progressive overall. We had a few interactions. I said I liked the way he wrote, even though I didn't agree with him. But the thing is, there were things McGowan did that I never understood how he could come to certain conclusions. For instance, he wrote a book called Programmed to Kill.
I'm in that book, and actually he repeats this totally ridiculous rumor that I cut my own ear off as a sacrifice to Satan, and he even got the wrong ear. So when you read something like that about yourself written authoritatively, you have to doubt what else is written so authoritatively. Just as an aside, I mean, he even dragged me into his fantasies.
Well, most of that book hinges on a certain claim. He wanted to look at Henry Lee Lucas, who was the basis for Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. And Henry Lee Lucas and his partner Otis Toole basically said, oh, we were part of a nationwide cult which involved the police and human sacrifices, and it was called the Hand of Death. But that's assuming you can believe Henry Lee Lucas, who admitted to being the confessions killer. He would make up confessions to get special privileges in prison.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is that, well, Susan Atkins told a bunch of hysterical, ludicrous horror stories that are not true. They never happened. And yet you ask people about the so-called Manson murders, and Susan Atkins' insane fantasies are what people believe happened. And then, or another parallel to the Henry Lucas story and the gullibility of believing him is Maury Terry and the whole Son of Sam process nonsense that was put across in The Ultimate Evil, and even brought this person, William Metzner, this idea that he was Manson 2, which actually I am going to debunk that as well in a future project. So Ultimate Evil with Maury Terry, McGowan with The Hand of Death. This is like a genre. Again, it's like a pornography. It's not. It's fantasy. It's the equivalent of telling ghost stories around the fire. There's nothing to do with reality.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned The Ultimate Evil. When I read that book, I started laughing out loud at the end when, out of nowhere, Maury Terry brings in Ted Gunderson, Mr. FBI, Mr. Ambulance Chaser himself, a man who was involved on the authority of people I've talked to in COINTELPRO and was proud of it. A man that basically equated anyone who was a humanist with Satanism. I mean,
well, of course, he targeted Xena during the Satanic Panic. I mean, they had personal confrontation. So, I mean, having been the focus of conspiracy theories and having ridiculous rumors and conspiracy theories projected on me, I know how easy it is to get dragged into that. So that's why I've absolutely when people say, well, I have a little sympathy for these people. No, I don't have sympathy, because these are just fantasists making up entertaining fiction. And frankly, the audience for this kind of conspiracy theory don't care if it's true. They want to believe it's true, and they like the feeling of knowing a secret, but they don't care that it's completely illogical and not connected to reality. So, yeah, so the new myth that's replacing Helter Skelter, even more than secondarily, is there's an increasing belief among truly Manson apologists, that the crimes were somehow noble because they were to free Bobby Beausoleil, which to me is not noble. Why is freeing some scummy murderer of a friend a noble thing to do? There was a scintilla of that being part of the way the crimes were done, but that wasn't the motive for the crimes. But replacing that even more is this ideological idea that the 60s were all phony, that any of the legitimate liberatory impulses of the 60s were intrinsically false, because really it was the evil MK Ultra, CIA, Illuminati steering it all, and it was all an act of social engineering to control people And, none of rock music was sincerely rebellious. It was a way to entrap young people in a CIA plot. And that finally, the ludicrous notion that killing a hairdresser, an actress, an heiress, and a Polish expatriate would somehow automatically be a foolproof way to smear the hippie movement. It's illogical if you really look at the thing. But we live, it's even worse than that. We live in a time where the White House is pushing conspiracy theories that are even more ludicrous than that, and has been for years. So we've lost connection with reality, and conspiracy theory has become the norm. And I'm not saying conspiracies don't happen. Of course, our conversation is centered on the fact that powerful people use their clout and power to cover up their crimes.
I was just going to add, I don't think it's just powerful people. I think it's people like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam himself. I think he concocted this story so he could start his little ministry in prison.
Well, like Tex Watson did as well, sure. Absolutely.
Well, I want to add, too, I've always told people, the big conspiracy with everything Ted Gunderson did was that his whole modus operandi and everything he promoted in all of his lectures was to attack anyone that went against his Christian conservative values. He was just trying to smear anyone who held progressive or liberatory values. It was all about a political agenda.
Well, that seems to me at the heart. And what is strange, just because I've mentioned Tom O'Neill, who, was a friend of mine, and I have no personal animus against him, I just don't agree with his theory, is he is a liberal, an anti-Trumpian, traditional, democratic liberal, as far as I can tell. And yet his pushing of this MK Ultra deep state designed brainwashing instruction scenario basically supports this very conservative, the 60s were all a phony front idea, and there really was nothing liberatory or revolutionary about them. It was all a CIA psychological operation.
What I think this is a good segue into the issues of Satanism and, the neo-Nazis that have inserted themselves into the Manson story. I think we can start with Anton LaVey, who we talked about Ted Gunderson. Inadvertently we brought him up. I honestly think people like LaVey almost viewed Ted Gunderson as a foil to themselves. I think LaVey helped with the Satanic Panic, and he put all the pressure on Zena. Zena was the only one that wanted to fight back against the claims. Anton LaVey said he had no interest.
Absolutely, and I know that firsthand, and I think that's a very important point you make is, I know this goes completely against the ludicrous putting up on a pedestal of Anton LaVey that the current crop of LaVeyites insist on doing, despite all evidence to the contrary. If on a human level, Anton LaVey was a depressed, agoraphobic person who found it very difficult to deal with the outer world and could hardly leave his house. That is the person I knew. And he was not able to, and he didn't even recognize the danger of the Satanic Panic. I can tell you from firsthand, it was Zena who saw the Michelle Remembers and the first burgeoning of the Satanic Panic rising from the evangelical movement, and she saw the danger when she was in her early 20s and said to him, look, we have to do something about this. It's not funny anymore. This is an existential threat. They are going to frame us. They are harassing people. They as it went into things like the McMartin case, she went to him and said, we have to do something about it. He was not willing to. And she said this publicly in an interview shortly before she resigned from her position as the high priestess of the Church of Satan, that he was hiding in his house while she was out there taking the heat for this thing. And she successfully confronted the evangelical right, who really were a paper tiger because they were lying. And by merely being a presence and confronting them with their lies, she pretty much knock the steam out of the satanic panic. But he was too timid and cowardly to go out there to confront these people. And as you say, he got a kind of adolescent perverse delight out of the publicity, because in fact the Church of Satan had largely been forgotten until the satanic panic made it seem threatening rather than a tiresome kind of faded relic of the 60s, which is what it was seen for most of the, in the mid-70s. In the 80s, when the born-again movement and the revived right-wing Christian fundamentalists seized on Satanism as their new ideological bugaboo, they made the Church of Satan and LaVey's legacy seem important. Before that, it had been forgotten. So yeah, he had a very ambiguous position. He certainly did nothing to combat it whatsoever. Nothing.
Well, it was good for business, wasn't it, for LaVey, in a way?
Well, it was to a certain extent, but also the business, you have to understand, it was never any. It's like he was a minor L. Ron Hubbard. He wanted to be a millionaire cult leader like L. Ron Hubbard, but he didn't have the ambition or even the drive to go out and do what L. Ron Hubbard did. So any publicity was good publicity. And yes, I can tell you, he really didn't mind if people thought he was killing babies or sacrificing people if it got him a little attention, because he has his whole, quote, religion, which was really just a mom and pop business. It started when this publicist, Edward Weber, in 1966 said to him, you should form a religion, which again is very much like L. Ron Hubbard saying if you wanted to make money, you wouldn't be a penny a word pulp writer, you would go out and start a religion. Hubbard and LaVey are very similar figures. It's just Hubbard operated on a higher budget and a more efficient psychopathology, whereas LaVey didn't really have the drive to do it properly. So yeah, for that kind of self-publicist, any publicity is good publicity. And, Xena took it seriously. To him, it had started as a kind of joke. And he never really left the bubble of the crumbling black house to look at the damage this was doing to real people. And he never cared about that because he had no empathy. He had no compassion even for other, quote, Satanists, unquote. And Xena did. And she went out there in sincerity to fight the forces of ignorance, and she succeeded in defeating them. And he became jealous of her efforts and bizarrely tried to even thwart them. But, that's a long story for her to tell eventually. But yes, you're absolutely right in your intuition. He didn't confront the dragon of the right-wing Christian threat. He let his 20-something-year-old daughter go out and take the heat for it and endangered her many times. I mean, that's the untold part of the story.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the agoraphobia. I mean, he admitted that. He would say in interviews in later in his life, he would say, I would rather just sit in my home in my underwear and watch, the goldfish go around in my tank. He fancied himself the character from Dr. Fives. He would rather hang out around mannequins, is what he would tell people. I mean, this was, not exactly a happy person.
No, he was. I'm always loath to pretend that I'm being objective about it. He was a horrible person. His character, he was an unethical person who didn't do 90% of any of the things he ever did. For me, that he claimed to do. For me, that is reason enough to reject his entire legacy. Most of his books are plagiarism. Most of his claims are things he actually never did. From the basking in the glory of Marilyn Monroe, who he never even met, to stealing the work of Ragnar Redbeard for his book. This is a low-level, sleazy thief who, as I said, basked in the limelight of other people's creations.
Well, I was going to add, too, real quickly, there's a new book of the final words of Anton LaVey, final interviews. And there's one point, I believe, where he tries to take credit for the McDonald's shooting done by James Oliver Uberty in the 80s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, during our brief friendship, which lasted from February of 1988 to January of 1990, and the last part of it was mostly tension and fighting and quarreling. In that people associate me with him like I was deeply involved with him. I was not. I was in love with his daughter, and therefore I was there. But our relationship became contentious, and there was a point where I would go to the Black House late at night when I lived in San Francisco, and his main interest was his hatred of his ex-common law wife, partner, who he never married, Diane Hegarty. And this will give you an insight into how he thought. He thought because the name Hegarty, Diane Hegarty's name, sounded like Huberty, that the fact that Huberty was involved in this ridiculous, there's nothing good or honorable or anything to praise about James Huberty going to a McDonald's and shooting people. He's a pathetic fucking loser who should not be admired. But he admired him because he believed there was some kind of magical connection between the name Huberty and Haggerty. And his main concern, whether people want to pretend he was this great magician or not, when I knew him, he was driven by his hatred of his former partner, Diane Hegarty, and that's why he glorified this Huberty murder, because he thought in these terms, and his hatred of Michael Aquino, who he also fantasized about dying or killing or sending people out to kill him. He was a very petty person, with no higher or any kind of noble aspirations. He was a person filled with vindictive desire for revenge, for anything he considered a humiliation. That this woman left him was a humiliation, that he could even glorify a James Huberty because of it. So I think that's a good point that you bring up. And then the final thing I'll mention for people that are interested in looking into it, we were talking about the Sidney Korshaks and the Robert Evans and the Epsteins and all of these powerful men who cover up the crimes of others. But behind the Church of Satan, it's important to understand that the main financial source for the Church of Satan, which never was it was never making millions through the Satanic Bible, I can tell you that. It was not this huge, monolithic, sinister, industrial force that some people have blackwashed it, let's use that word, to pretend it to be. It was the financial backing for the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey from the early days was a figure named Donald Werby, who was a real estate tycoon in San Francisco, who owned a lot of valuable property and many important hotels in San Francisco. And he was a major donor in the Democratic Party, which of course is always was very mob connected in San Francisco because of the Italian mob and the Democratic Party, which I'm sure you know about that. Werby was tried, and he managed through his wealth to get out of being convicted of major child molesting crimes. And in fact, he was responsible for a child molestation in the LaVey family, which Anton knew about, covered up, and allowed to happen. And among all the many loathsome things about Anton LaVey, that to me is one of the most unforgivable. And the full story of that will eventually come out. But there was the banality of evil, this phrase that Hannah Arendt said, which is overused, really sums up the Church of Satan and LaVey, because behind all the goofy and corny theatrics was this very real evil of Donald Werby, a child sex molester who LaVey allowed to use the church as a poaching ground. So I think when people think it was all fun and games and Jane Mansfield and Sammy Davis, they aren't looking at the real darkness that's there.
When you say a poaching ground, are you referring to who were the type of people LaVey got involved? Because I know he got a lot of women involved, and, it seems like he was a pimp.
LaVey was a pimp. Yes, he absolutely. The reason Sammy Davis Jr. got involved, and I mentioned this in the Manson File, because Sammy Davis Jr. was a friend of Jay Sebring, and actually Christopher Lee confirmed this to me. Christopher Lee was a very good friend of Sammy Davis, and when I first met him, he knew about my connection to LaVey and was rather appalled by it, actually. And he told me that he said the only reason his friend Sammy Davis Jr. even got involved to the very minimal degree that he did with LaVey was because LaVey provided him with women, which that was it. And that is a lot of this satanic witch training. For instance, LaVey would say, give me a certain amount of money and come over to the Black House and I will teach you to be a satanic witch. What he was really doing is grooming women to be prostitutes, and he would send them out and to get money from tricks, and they would pay him with. So in other words, that's a pimp pretending to teach satanic witchcraft. That was a lot of his income during the period when he was surviving as a counselor in supposed how to be a satanic witch and then how to be a prostitute. And I am not making a moral judgment on prostitutes. Some of my best friends have been prostitutes. I'm just saying, if you really want to look at this man's legacy, let's look at what it really is, not what you would like to pretend it to be.
Well, so when you say poaching, though, are you implying that maybe LaVey had underage girls involved?
No. I don't know about that. I'm just gonna say at this point, a family member of LaVey was abused publicly by Donald Werby, who was a known child sex molester who managed not to go to prison, kind of like Epstein until his recent mysterious demise, only because of his wealth. He kept buying off the corrupt San Francisco police and managed to keep them away. So a family member of LaVey was abused by Donald Werby, and LaVey allowed that to happen. And because he needed Werby's financial support to survive, he didn't report it, and he looked the other way. So,
and
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, when self-righteous Satanists say, how dare you accuse us of child molestation or doing anything illegal? Well, LaVey did approve of at least one instance of child molestation in his own family. He allowed it to happen, and he was a wife beater. He was a pimp. He was a violent, depressed, unhappy person who created a lot of... He also
beat his pet lion, according to Xena.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And of course, Xena is, by the LaVeyan loyalists, called routinely batshit crazy, and she's insane. Well, she was there. They weren't. She saw what was happening, and she reported it. And it's interesting, in the age of Me Too, not that I'm even entirely sympathetic with a certain degree of hysteria and witch hunting that unfortunately happens with any moral panic, but you would think with all of the notorious and powerful figures that have been dragged into the Me Too movement's controversy in the satanic world, these supposed transgressors and people who are willing to break sacred cows, they don't want to get into the fact that their idol, was an abuser of women, a pimp, and someone who exploited women for his business. And I think that's incredibly hypocritical, especially when they claim to be forces of liberation and freedom and Luciferian liberty.
Well, I mentioned the animal abuse that Xena has mentioned in interviews because he says we should treat animals with respect. That was LaVey's
that's what I mean by hypocrisy. We should treat children and animals with the highest respect, unless we need the money of a child molester. Then we'll ignore it. And he was abusive to animals. So he was a hypocrite. And, if someone wants to admire him, then they need to admire him as a wife beater, a pimp, and an excuser of child molestation. And when people think I'm unreasonable in my condemnation of him, or think that Xena is a treacherous maniac for turning her back on that kind of toxicity, then they should look at their own ethical framework.
Well, last thing on LaVey and then James Mason, and we'll wrap up. He's, LaVey is known for sort of adding an Addams Family type aesthetic to what is essentially social Darwinism with Ragnar Redbeard's Might Makes Right. I want to get your thoughts on social Darwinism and whether LaVey actually lived by that credo.
He didn't live by any credo, but by day-to-day opportunism. As far as the person I knew, was a petty hustler who thought, how can I get somebody to take me out to a steak dinner, or how can I get $100? He was a low-level hustler who had this tired scam of selling, at that time, $100 red cards to the Infernal Empire. And he was a low-level con man, basically. I don't think he believed anything. He was a narcissist. He was a pathological liar. He was somebody who had this little niche business, and he pushed it to the degree that he could to the gullible. And the main thing I can say about him is he believed whatever the person he was talking to at the moment wanted him to believe. And that's what he would give them, like many half-assed con men and scam artists. I think underneath it, he was a hollow man. He was empty. He didn't even believe in Satanism itself. Again, comparative to L. Ron Hubbard telling his intimates, well, I don't believe in all that Scientology nonsense. You don't think I believe in that? It was his act. It was literally like going to a cheap carnival act. And of course the carny does his spiel, does his ballyhoo, but does the carny, when the freaks go home and the bearded lady leaves, does he believe in it? The final thing I can say is read the novel Nightmare Alley, about this con artist who invents a spook house and becomes a geek, and you will see that was the prototype and role model for Anton LaVey, and that he became that figure. So, or if you can't read, which I know many people involved in that world are not very literate, at least watch the movie Nightmare Alley, and you will see this was the self-destructive magic he did. He based himself on that character in Nightmare Alley, and he became that. A very depressing, squalid life, not one to be admired or emulated.
Well, in that regard, I'll say this. I've always found it interesting, and I don't know, maybe you have different thoughts on social Darwinism and Might Makes Right, but the type of people that promote it, not just LaVey, but everyone I know who promotes this sort of social Darwinist, extreme social Darwinist outlook on the world, where everything is tooth and claw and there is no cooperation ever. There's some of the people that I think are most likely to get their asses beat. So that's all I really have to say in regards to LaVey's sort of philosophy.
Well, this is an important psychological aspect. I can't speak for all the people who say that, but he, and by his own admission, in talking to him and from family members I talked to, as a child, he was bullied. He was beaten up. He was treated like a misfit. And of course, the people that idolize him will say that's because he was a misunderstood genius. I say it's because he was basically a socially maladroit. There was something wrong with him, and other kids sensed that, and they picked on him. And his hatred of society and his so-called social Darwinism and his law of the strong, like you said, is obviously psychologically acute. It's actually a weak person putting on the persona of strength, but it's out of resentment and out of hatred of the people who humiliated him. He was not actually a predator. He was a weakling who was a spiteful and cruel person because I think it was W.H. Auden who said, people who are cruel because others have been cruel to them. And that sums him up. He was a wounded person, like an animal had been kicked and beaten, and so he made a religion out of kicking and beating others. But it was out of weakness, not strength.
This is actually a good segue into James Mason and the problem of lone wolf terrorism that we're seeing in this sort of post-truth era. There was just a shooting. The Garlic Gilroy Festival shooter said he was influenced by Might Makes Right, and like LaVey, all these shooters, these people like the Garlic Gilroy shooter and the Elliot Rogers, all of these people seem like rather pathetic people. And I think this can lead us into James Mason, the neo-Nazi, I guess, quote-unquote Satanist, who I guess was a massive...
I should point out, to be fair and objective to him, he has, since his long prison term, he became a kind of Christian. And although he is still sympathetic, strangely, to LaVey, I don't know why, and I never really agreed with him on that point. He actually is now, I believe, has become a student of Revelation and a belief in the prophetic meaning of the Bible. So I should point out he has significant, I haven't looked in any great detail into it, but he presents himself as some kind of Christian now. So at least to be fair to what his current belief system is. I don't see how Christianity can be combined with might is right, but there you go. I expect coherence and consistency.
Because I find that interesting, because my understanding was that he's involved now with the Atomwaffen division, which are these sort of wannabe terrorist white supremacists.
Well, as far as I understand it, and again, I'm looking at it from a historical point of view, and I should point out to your listeners, the reason I'm willing to address this is in the Manson File, the first edition in 1988, I made the choice because Charlie told me about his already fraying friendship, because they had a falling out even when I knew Mason a long time ago in the 80s and early 90s. Charlie told me about James Mason and said that he had some unreleased music, and that is why I got in touch with James Mason, and I made the decision to include some of James Mason's then totally unknown in 1988 outside of the tiny insular world of National Socialist revolutionaries. Nobody had heard of him. And so I brought him to public attention through the Manson File because I thought what he had to say about Manson was interesting. And I still do. And I don't regret showing that here's somebody who's taking Manson's ideas seriously and looking at him as a philosopher rather than a maniac. And then I included an interview with James in Charles Manson Superstar, which has made him even more known, because audiovisual things make a much deeper impact than reading in our illiterate age. So in a way, I brought him to the degree of public attention he had, and then of course he became almost a hip figure in the industrial alternative scene for a little while. Like to as Susan Sontag coined that phrase, fashionable fascism, he became almost like a hip figure in the industrial scene, the so-called apocalyptic scene. And then then he slipped back into obscurity for a long time, and then the Atomwaffen adopted him. As far as I know, he didn't originate it. They discovered Siege, and I believe
he's an advisor to them,
yeah.
But I don't think he invented it. Yeah.
No, he didn't set out to create this movement. They found Siege, and in their Reddit 4chan world of the internet, push Siege as the new manifesto, and then they found him, and he's sort of like their mascot or inspiration. But just to get the facts right, I don't think he set out to create this movement.
Right.
But he also has not condemned their actions, and he's made fairly ambiguous statements, sort of like the statement he made about the Manson murders which is, deliberately provocative, couldn't have happened to a nicer bunch of people, referring to the victims who he saw as, exemplars of Hollywood decadence that deserved to die. He hasn't condemned the crimes and murders and violence that the Atomwaffen people have proudly committed, but he's taken a very ambiguous stance on it. But all of this is connected. When you say Elliot Rodgers, James Mason is more intelligent than Elliot Rodgers, but all the things we're talking about, LaVey and Satanism and the belief in simplistic cartoon ideologies that pit the good versus the evil. And in some cases, we are evil, therefore we're good versus the good. It doesn't matter. It's a divisiveness, a dualism, a tribalism.
It's a Conan the Barbarian view of reality that makes no sense to anyone that's a grown adult. I mean, that's just my view.
No, I agree with you. This is the world we live in now, and look at the idiot in the White House is the very epitome of that. So how far away is Trump from LaVeyan Satanism, for instance? Really, he exemplifies it. Sheer selfishness, making up an illusory world that has nothing to do with reality, but his admirers applaud him for his Baron Munchausen fantasies. Is that isn't that basically creating an artificial environment and, survival of the fittest and greed without any ethical boundaries? So we've gone from things that used to be at the furthest margins of society in the 80s or 70s and would be considered, ultra, and now they are the mainstream. I can't think of anything worse than that.
Well, just to clarify here,
when you say Conan the Barbarian, that's Robert E. Howard's creation. I would go further. Barbarian, literally, we are living in the total downfall of civilization, and the barbarians are not only at the gates, they are, they're here, they're everywhere. The mainstream world is barbaric. This is the Kali Yuga that people romanticized. Well, this is the apocalypse they were thinking of, and it's not as pretty as you think it would be when it's actually happening.
I guess to wrap up on James Mason, I guess my confusion initially came from, I had forgot that he published in 2000 this thing called The Theocrat, where he compared Bible passages to passages in Mein Kampf. So I guess he did sort of leave Satanism, but he never really left the quote-unquote movement.
No, and I think he still admires LaVey for some reason. Yeah.
Well, what do you make of just this whole resurgence of interest in Siege? I've heard rumors that there's going to be a fourth printing. It basically advocates for lone wolf terrorism, commit as many crimes as possible to damage the system. I mean, it seems very adolescent and nihilistic to me.
Well, I understand that most people just want to condemn things, and that is the barbaric way of dealing things. Like you said, this adolescent dualism, Conan the Barbarian thinking, but I don't think like that. So let's look at this calmly and soberly from a historical point of view. What that sort of thing you're saying, what that's advocating, just random acts of violence has never had any kind of political significance. It does not destroy the system. It never has. For instance, let's take the left wing, the RAF, and the Red Army faction, and the many communist and Marxist and anarchist left-wing extremists in the 70s in Europe. They achieved absolutely nothing by random acts of violence against citizens and officials who had no real political power, except making themselves hated, demonized, and dead. They destroyed themselves through their actions. And that's exactly what's going to happen with these people. I don't care if you call yourself right or left, and I'm not, as I've said before, I'm not on either side of any ideology. But what political purpose would that gain? I mean, terrorism only make sense if you have power behind you and you have the capability to carry out a revolution and you actually have a program to institute. This is not the case here. So these are frustrated people causing pain because, as I've said about people like LaVey, they're unhappy and they want to, share the misery with others. This is not a political ideology or anything that has any historical future. It's just cruelty for its own sake under the guise of an ideology. And I would say that's probably true for many of the young, confused Muslims who get involved with Islamic fundamentalism. Do they really believe in the ideology, or are they sexually frustrated and unhappy people who can't achieve anything in their life except to strike out and create some kind of ego thrill by a moment of causing somebody else's pain? So I can't even take it seriously on a political level. What political aims does that gain? Adolf Hitler had a political program. Benito Mussolini had a political program and a very tightly organized power structure that, when their revolutions were instituted, could take power. Whether you agree with it or not is another issue. That's not comparable to this kind of random, spasmodic violence for its own sake. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I would add that I think this actually, you may disagree with this, but I think it actually predates even the alt-right. And what you mentioned with there are ways to look at this with regards to the left too. But when I look at the neo-Nazi skinhead movement, I mean, last time you were on, we talked about Tom Metzger, and when I look at some of the underlings within the skinhead movement, a lot of it just seems like really alienated young angry men. Many people in the skinhead movement had drug problems. A lot of it's dysfunctional and antisocial people.
Methadone was a big problem in the skinhead movement, for instance. Yeah, look. Well, you're looking at the human factor rather than this hysteric. I can't take the ideology seriously anymore from anybody, extreme left or extreme right. I see dysfunctional, suffering people trying to grasp desperately at some meaning by defining themselves as superior and others as inferior. But obviously that's a compensation, as far as I can see, and I think we're saying the same thing, for their own sense of impotence and lack of significance. It's a coping mechanism, a defense mechanism against their own insignificance. It's not a serious movement, in other words.
And the last thing I wanted to get your comments on, because we were talking about it before we record it, was this whole issue of incels. And in a way, the media is covering it much, much more lately, when really they make up, an even smaller portion of the population than the transgender community. I mean, these people are kind of just angry women haters. That's the bottom line. It's not that they can't get laid; they just hate women. Or at least that's my interpretation.
I absolutely agree with you. And of course, not only as a tantric Buddhist, but through my whole life, veneration of the feminine principle has been a key element to all of my work. So all of this misogyny and hatred of women is completely loathsome to me, and I condemn it in the harshest terms. And I see it as pathological and intrinsically out of step with nature and reality. So, I mean, I have no sympathy for, I also don't have sympathy for hysterical neo-feminism, I should point out. It's not like, because Americans in particular cannot quite conceive that you could condemn both sides of something, but I do. So the hysteria and the demonizing of the other side on both sides, all men are evil and the patriarchy is a fascist plot to destroy women, I reject that as much as the incel demonization of women. Both of them are based on a pathological imbalance between the genders. So, I just have to say, I see people that have a certain sympathy for that kind of misogyny, and I have absolutely none. And the misogyny is something that is the thread between many of these things you're talking about. LaVeyan Satanism, the Incel movement, the alt-right, is the hatred of women seems to be a motivating, driving force.
Do you think the incel aspect of the alt-right and this sort of misogyny of the young alt-right, do you think that was uncommon in past iterations of the far right? Is this a new phenomenon?
Yes, I think it's a new mutation of it. I didn't see it at the time when I was investigating the far right in the 80s. I see this, extreme hatred of women. Women were more involved with it. If historically, if you go into Italian fascism and National Socialism, certainly by modern standards, you could say they were sexist, but hatred of women was certainly not a factor when you think of figures like Leni Riefenstahl or how much women were involved in the fascist movement, the real fascist movement in Italy. So yes, there were certainly, by feminist standards, you would say they were patriarchal, but there was a love and respect for women in both of those movements, as extreme as they were, which you do not find in this current pathological. I don't even really consider it connected. I think it's a totally new mutation that has to do with internet search for an identity. And I think you can find that with many things, including, as you touched on this, the tiny, insignificant amount of the population that are transsexual and genuinely are, and then the fad of it. That seems to me to be the flip side of the incel movement. And I know that will be controversial, but what I see, having lived long enough to see these waves, the internet has created this field where people must find an ego identity to give themselves meaning in their life. And, I don't care what it is. There's something, it's not very different than being an Instagram influencer. It's very shallow. There's no real depth to any of these things. These are like post-civilization movements that are based entirely on a narcissistic need to have an identity, to have a cause, whether it's a real cause or not, or whether it has any actual significance.
It just reminded me there's one more thing I wanted to mention, and then I promise to let you go. I know we've talked long here. I've been investigating things like the Jeffrey Epstein case going back to September. I'm now looking more into the Nexium case, which has become known as the Hollywood sex cult, although I think that doesn't do that story justice. And most people are using these cases as a political bludgeon. It was the Clintons, or it was Trump in regards to Epstein. With Nexium, you had these women being branded. Human branding, starvation diets, all kinds of things. And people just want to spin it as, look, they funded the Clintons at one point illegally or some such. Meanwhile, if you look at the leader of that cult, Keith Raniere, he was a David Koresh-ian anti-government Ayn Rand fan.
Right.
And, no one wants to get at the fact of these things.
I mean, in the immortal words of Kellyanne Conway, alternative facts. That is the universe we live in now with every single subject. So for somebody who's trying to determine the truth in a world where people don't even care what the truth is, it's very frustrating. They would rather care that the nonsensical conspiracy theory, the partisan belief system that they're pushing is not valid. They only care that it makes them feel better. That's the problem, is deciding what facts are based on emotion rather than reality. So yeah, I agree with you, absolutely.
Do you think that cases like Epstein and Nexium are going to be any kind of sea change for the powers that be? Do you see things changing with regards to the level of corruption, maybe a pushback against it?
I think that's certainly happening, but the pendulum will swing both ways because definitely we have seen since the Harvey Weinstein case exploded, and I could get into that in great detail. For instance, Rowan Farrow, who was the son of Mia Farrow, revealing the Harvey Weinstein case, the immensity of the sexual abuse and the efforts of the cover-up. Well, his mother, as far as I know, was deeply involved in the cover-up of the Cielo Drive murders. Rowan Farrow should look into that. And I think that ties all these things together, is the secret history of American corruption is certainly rising to the surface. But I think that's more because the whole system is collapsing, not because there's a positive impetus to truth and justice, but because the entire infrastructure of America is falling apart. So even the corrupt elite can't hide their skeletons anymore. I would say it could be potentially seen as a positive expose of abuse of power, but what you're seeing is an endemic falling apart of everything. So therefore, all the dirty laundry is coming out as the ship sinks. That is my pessimistic view of it. I don't think that we're entering a golden age of truth. I think it's just everything's falling apart drastically, and so it's all coming out in the wash.
Well, Nikolas, I want to thank you again for providing us with a little bit of a parallax view on a number of topics, and I want to give you a chance to promote your upcoming speaking engagements and the Illusionist.
Okay, yeah. As I said in the earlier part of the interview, I should point out, as the Manson File, as you say, the final chapter, it's a file, so a file is never totally closed, but I have to be done with this 33-year period of my life with Charles's passage. There will always be new information, but that is the end of my active pursuit of it. When the Manson File comes out, I'm now concentrating mostly on my music and my creative pursuits rather than my repertorial or research pursuits. So the Illusionist is a symbolic bridge between that part of my life and the next part of my life. I will be giving, as I gave this speech and screening of my film in Los Angeles on August 10th, in November, which is the month of the second anniversary of Charlie's passage, on November 18th in London, November 19th in Bristol, and November 20th in Manchester, I will be giving a series of lectures called the Charles Manson Conspiracy about the nature of Mansonology and where my research stands on the 50th anniversary of the crimes. And the release of The Illusionist and these two new videos that will be coming out in connection with it. And after that, I will devote myself mostly to music, which is my main passion. And then something we were going to discuss, but maybe we can another time, is my novel, which is a quite ambitious undertaking that one of my students compared to the Ring of the Nibelungen for how much effort and time I've put into it, is a trilogy of novels called the Dallas Book of the Dead, which also gets into many of these themes of hidden history and what the truth is as opposed to the illusion. And that is tangentially focused as a framing device on the Kennedy assassination, but it actually is a novel about the nature of reality itself. So those are some of the things on the horizon.
Well, Nikolas, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views.
And I should say, Parallax Views, I mean, I know where you got that title, and that's one of my favorite films, and people should see it because it certainly was prophetic of the times that we live in.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nikolas Schreck. If you're interested in exploring Nikolas's musical output or as he sometimes refers to it, sonic magic. You can currently purchase his latest album, The Illusionist, courtesy of Records Ad Nexium, who, I should add, have also released works by such cult favorites as Psychic TV, Christian Deaths, Jetan Demone, and Kembra Fowler. All that and more available from Records Ad Nexium on Bandcamp. Also, keep an eye out for the final updated edition of the Manson File. As an aside on that note, I believe the last edition of the Manson File was published in Europe. But it is my understanding at this time that this final updated edition will be more widely available to American audiences. Whatever one thinks of Charles Manson, and I must say I myself am not a devotee, I feel that Nikolas provides a rather interesting and even probable alternative explanation of the Tate LaBianca murders in contrast to the widely accepted Vincent Bugliosi helter-skelter narrative. But what do you think? Let me know by dropping me a line on Twitter at ViewsParallax or by email at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. If you enjoyed this edition of Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where we just released a raw video version of my conversation with Shane Bugbee, and are working on a new edition of the Parallax Views current events program, The Week That Was. Your support is very much appreciated and is what allows Parallax Views to keep going. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.